You, Yoala.
Yeah, great. Welcome. I'm just going to give you a second here to arrive with all the technology. I hope you've been having a good conference day already, or maybe a good conference day ahead of you, depending on the time zones. We just learned that our panelists, it's very early where they are. So a special thank you for showing up for us so early. My name is Uela Jacobs. I'm going to be moderating this panel together with Walter Furness, who will now give us a little bit of tech information.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Shuela. If you've been joining us so far in some of these sessions, you'll know we're trying to use the Q&A function to submit questions to our speakers. So please do that. We'd love to hear from you. There's also the chat, but the Q&A is useful in compiling those questions. And we are getting toward the end of all of our sessions here, but hopefully you'll be able to replay some of them. Any that you might have missed, we'll be working on getting those added to YouTube, our YouTube channel. It might take us a little while, but we'll be doing that. And Uella, sorry, did you want me to go ahead with introductions or pass it back over to you? Okay. All right, so we have a split session here. We've got two wonderful speakers. First up, we have Lesley. She is a cultural geographer and the Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor at the University of Melbourne, Australia. She has worked on human-plant relations in contexts that include Indigenous resource management, suburban backyards, agriculture, and invasives. She's a co-editor of Vegetal Politics, Belonging, Practices, and Places. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, turn it over to her.
Thanks very much, Walter, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning or this afternoon. I'm just sharing my screen here. So I'm going to start by acknowledging that I live and work on Wurundjeri land, which was never ceded. I also acknowledge that although I'm not today focusing on Indigenous plant knowledge, I have learnt a lot in my plant journey from Indigenous collaborators and scholars. So I take as my point of departure the conference call for more respectful and collaborative human relationships with plants. To explore how we negotiate such relationships in adversarial contexts when we are killing plants, excluding them, or removing them. The ethics of death and killing are never far from human-plant relations, whether it's weeding, eating, biosecuring. Examples I draw on today relate to the management of weeds and invasive species. So we know that invasive species are considered to be one of the most significant environmental problems of the 21st century, becoming more severe under climate change. Evidence suggests that the Anthropocene, the period of human domination of Earth's surface processes, will increasingly be characterised by surprise, uncertainty, and non-linear change as different environmental thresholds are crossed, exemplified in this slide by the exponential curves that we're also familiar with. In this context, we have to think not only of the question of mutual flourishing and respect, but also what it means to manage or govern an environmental issue. In Australia, and I know in many North American contexts, where I presume most of you are, the dominant discourse in which we frame invasive species management is one of war and battle. Yet it's increasingly a war we can't win for many reasons. So there are two key adversarial axes which I'm going to discuss. Both of these exclude in some way. Firstly, the question of killing and killability, and second, the question of belonging and nativeness. I'm drawing examples from a number of collaborative projects, particularly with my colleague Jenny Atchison. Our methods are ethnobotanical in the sense that they involve field visits, semi-structured interviews and participant observation with hundreds of people, including those having professional responsibility for invasive plant management, either through policy planning or on groundwork, and those who manage invasives in their own domestic gardens. So the sites that I'm drawing on come across northern, eastern and central Australia. It's a bit of a big picture thing. The combination of ethnographic approaches and methods of botanical sensing used in our work have by no means broken free of what Jones and Cloak called the magnetic attraction of the human core. And much more work is needed in this area. There are distinctive methodological challenges in accessing some of the more subtle aspects of plant agency. So what does it mean to do ethnobotany in such a context? Nevertheless, the scale of our approaches, bodily, local and grounded, does offer an important way to analyse the intricacies of practices and relations. Recognising planty capacities, as so many papers in this conference are doing, has much to offer ethical discussions by taking us beyond the avoidance of death as the preferred baseline. It's necessary then to think explicitly about killing and killability, but in very different ways from a moral extensionism argument in which human sentience or consciousness remains the yardstick. In the tropical savanna landscapes of Northern Australia, a dominant means of managing invasives is to kill them with various toxic sprays. Almost beyond imagination, a number of managers described to us being suited up in heavy-duty cotton clothing, long sleeves and long pants, and thick leather boots. Although a lightweight suit was developed at some point, people found that these were often torn apart after a few minutes' work and pretty much useless. And heavy-duty rubber watertight gloves, and some people choose to wear a breathing respirator to avoid inhaling the chemical treatment that's vaporised around the working area. Other individuals who we spoke to simply couldn't bear the restriction on breathing that wearing full respirators involved, and resorted to using more simple, although probably less protective face masks. Once all the gear is on and the work is underway, it's not possible to drink without removing it all and having a full washdown. At this point, the possibility of dehydration and heat stress becomes considerable. So clearly the threats are not only to the health of the plants, but also to the people and the wider landscapes. In the case of Calistegia, the rubber vine, we watched over a few days as the chopper pilot manoeuvred around the towers of rubber vine, angling the helitorch into the thick basal stems. Even as thick plumes of smoke rose and birds came circling in, attracted by the smoke, the pilot carefully flew around in ever-widening circles, maintaining visibility and a clear line of flight. Yes, this is as dangerous as it looks. A helicopter and hundreds of litres of potentially explosive fuel seemed like a pretty blunt instrument. But later, when Jenny went up with the pilot to view the results, she was left with strong impressions of calm and skill. Only the base of each vine was burnt. The canopy and most of the leaves were still intact. A second killable is Andropogon guyanus, the gamba grass. This was introduced through government policies as a pasture grass in the 1930s to assist the pastoral industry. It's one of the most governed species in Australia, if by governing we refer to the legislation and policy that surround it. Ecologists are concerned that its transformation of fire regimes is heading towards a threshold or tipping point that will change the tropical savannas of Northern Australia, a key area of biodiversity conservation, from savanna to grassland. So in this respect, the gamba grass is the classic Anthropocene dilemma. As you can hopefully imagine by looking at its bulky dry season fuel state in this photo, it promotes hotter, more intense fires which reach up into the tree canopy and often result in tree death. If we compare the top map, which is the actual distribution, and the lower map, which is the potential distribution, we can see the scale of the issue. The potential distribution is almost exactly contiguous with the distribution of tropical savanna in Australia. But the thing that's really prompted action on this is the prevalence of gamba in urban areas around Darwin. So the fire risk to people and property is driving more policy now than the risk to biodiversity. So living with both these weeds involves killing them on a fairly massive scale and in ways that are potentially damaging to people and other parts of the landscape. So let's go on to belonging and consider the kinds of exclusions and inclusions that flow from that concept. Many plants are defined as weeds by the fact of them not being native or not really belonging on the Australian continent. The concept of nativeness in Australia, as elsewhere, is a colonial construct. It is by definition a temporal concept that hinges on whether a plant was on the continent in May 1770, when English explorers and botanists Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander stepped ashore at Botany Bay in present-day Sydney. So we continue to wrestle with the contradictions that this situation leaves us with. It's nearly 20 years since I decided that the backyard was a good study site to rethink some of these issues and to look at the more everyday engagements with nature that people have. So we did a very big study comprising over 200 backyards in different parts of Australia. Our overall research findings agreed with previous Australian studies showing that the most popular garden types include exotic plant species, either alone or in combination with natives. So the group we called committed native gardeners was only 13% of our sample. And in fact, this overrepresents their frequency in the broader population because we're looking for them. Committed native gardeners had over 80% of their shrub and tree layout under native plants, which were also likely to include a higher proportion of plants indigenous to the local area. They described their reasons as relating to the fact that these plants belong. They were more likely to have open boundaries to adjacent bushland, and they talked about bringing nature into their backyard. And they used a discourse of purity. So here are two examples of that from Joanne. I love the Australian bush. I've been a bushwalker all my life. I like walking in it. And although I have grave doubts about Australian society, the bush itself to me is pure. Or Margot, yes, I've decided to become really pure. I wasn't quite so purist at the beginning, and I'd be tempted to have a little exotic here and there. But as time has gone on, I have really appreciated how the native garden looks and how I feel about it. I've decided that I'm going to be purist, and if anything foreign comes up, I'll take it. This purity often led them into conflict with their neighbours over other things that needed to be got rid of: trees, lawn, cats, and so on. So there are many tensions and contradictions in their attitudes and practice. For example, a key tension that participants encounter in removing invasive lantana is that its dense thickets provide valued habitat for many small native birds. That's felt in this example by Donald, who says, I feel pretty passionate about not having exotics, but I'm beginning to realise it's a bit more complicated than that now. That lantana isn't necessarily totally bad because it's bird habitat. A key feature of these expressions of nativeness is that they exclude the human selves, plus the dogs, cats, and veggie gardens. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that the whole way nativeness is defined in biogeography is about boundaries around the human rather than boundaries around the plant. Experiencing these tensions is not confined to committed native gardeners, as permaculturalist Duncan expresses. I guess the other angle is that, ultimately, we're probably not meant to be here either in terms of, white Anglo-Saxon human beings. And then everything we eat, well, 99% of the things we eat aren't native to Australia either. So you can see here how the question of belonging extends to people. So I've presented what may seem like contradictory examples: backyards where humans seem to be in control, imposing somewhat arbitrary categories for excluding or loving plants, and sparsely populated rangelands where the hope of human control may seem slight. In fact, these contexts have much in common, and their differences are of degree rather than kind. So what might we conclude? First, mutual flourishing and respect requires us to openly discuss the conditions under which we exclude plants, whether by killing them or defining them as not belonging. Respect, however, doesn't give us the automatic solutions or answers to such discussions. Second, living with weeds means being able to kill them. The ethical questions around this need further discussion, particularly in the context of arbitrary temporal boundaries. In the Australian case, the time frame of 1770 used to delineate what belongs and what doesn't, as seen in both these contexts. Third, living with weeds also means conceding that you can't control them. Governance seen as control will be impossible. There are lots of gaps between policy and practice in the rangelands, and in fact, lots of discussion among gardeners that I don't have time to share today with you around the impossibility of control. And finally, many land managers in both domestic and rangeland contexts are already in what we might think of as the Anthropocene new normal. They're pragmatic, they have variable practices, they have contingent knowledge that adapts as they go along. Which leads us to ask why the environmental ideal, which is often of purity, has not shifted. These practices and these on-the-ground knowledge provide lots of resources to understand different ways of doing things, and hence research into such practices will continue to be important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Excellent. We're going to move right on with our next talk and then have a shared Q&A. John Charles Ryan is an eco-poet and lifelong plant enthusiast. He publishes in the fields of environmental humanities and critical plant studies, including the forthcoming co-edited collection, The Mind of Plants, Narratives of Vegetal Intelligence. He has adjunct roles with Southern Cross University and Notre Dame University, both in Australia. John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Walter and Yuella, and thank you, Lesley, as well. Okay. So I'd like to talk about this topic of plants as creative beings in themselves, not plants so much as the objects of creativity, of creative endeavors, but as having their own creative capacities. And I'd like to do that through this concept of phytopoiesis. In being a poet and being a poetry critic, I'll draw in the relationship between plants as creative beings and practices of poetry. So, but I'd like to begin here with the Tree of Life, which is a series of aerial photos of Lake Kokora, Broomshead, New South Wales. These were published recently in The Guardian and elsewhere. And they were taken by a naturalist named Derry Moroney. So the gist of these images is that the tea trees, which are Melaleuca species, these are very common species across Australia, they color the water running into the lake after heavy storms, and these extraordinary patterns result. Great. Oops. But for me, it beckons the question of whether this is an ecological process or an expression of the creativity of nature, or both. Can we think of ecology as inherently creativity? Can we think of creativity as inherently ecological? And can we think of plants, in this case, Melaleuca trees, as inherently creative beings? We know well that they are ecological beings, but to what extent can we regard their creativity? So to this effect, I'd like to propose a concept of phytopoiesis, and I'd like to offer two theoretical points. The idea of making, of poiesis in the ancient sense as making, of poiesis as a property of life, and thus life having the capacity for creativity as making. And poiesis, secondly, as a disposition, as a human outlook on the world that adopts plant-like being. And then I'd like to show three ways that I've begun to think of phytopoiesis in practice through, first of all, the framework of literary ethnobotany, secondly, the idea of entheogenic poetry, and thirdly, collaborative human-plant writing. And then I'll give a few examples from my own work when I lived in New South Wales, in the Tablelands bioregion. So phytopoiesis in theory, as critical studies of plants burgeon, We see lots of neologisms coming up, and I'm certainly I've been at fault there. But yet here's another one of phytopoiesis, the making of plants, how plants make, not the making of plants into, but the making the plants perform themselves, the makings. And I'd like to define this idea firstly as a plant-like making that takes the botanical world as its focal point. Now, first of all, that's a fairly human view of plant making, but this sort of plant making might incorporate biocultural knowledge. If we look at a work of literature that becomes plant-like in its composition, that work might incorporate traditional human-plant relationships and forms of knowledge. That plant-like making can adopt taxonomic nomenclature, the difficult language of science, the taxonomic names that we are so obsessed with when it comes with that, especially that initial relationship that we forge with plants is often based on what is it, right? What species, what genus. This sort of making might experiment with speaking modes. So if we have a phytopoietic novel, that novel might experiment with the plant speaking back to the reader, or the plant speaking back to the narrator, or the plant speaking to other plant subjects within the work. And fourthly, the idea of a plant-like making as adopting the plant form itself. So as I'll show you with poetry, that could mean that the form of the poem integrates with the form of the plant within its environment. So it's a phytopoietic making. And the second aspect of this term is more broadly a social, cultural, and or psychological disposition that attempts to integrate modes of vegetal being in which the human is attempting to become more plant-like or to discover the inner plant essence of human being. So, for example, we might think of embodied cognition, of mindedness as a property of corporeality, of physical being in the world that plants have perfected and which we might learn from. The idea of percipient sessility, that plants are relatively immovable, right? That they're relatively sessile, but they have an extraordinary sense of perception and percipience, intelligent percipience, of recognizing the presence of other beings and adjusting accordingly, as Suzanne Simard's presentation just showed us. Of self-regeneration, the plant is often described as modular, right? So the plant can lose a leaf and not bleed to death. The plant can be dying in one part of its physical form, but then also budding in another part of its body, right? So this is what we might think of as heterotemporality, the ability to occupy multiple time modes at one time. And a plant has perfected this form of being with time. If you look at a tree, you might find, especially older trees in Australia, eucalypts and others, you might see one part of that tree decaying and at the end of its physical vitality, but then another part of the tree is budding. The boab trees are very ancient trees that I find this quality of heterotemporality very well expressed in. And polylingualism, plants encourage us to begin to think about language as a multiplicity, the ways of communicating not only through sound, but through chemical gestures and other forms of language that challenge our thinking about language. So plants as polylingual. These are the kinds of vegetal modes that we can contemplate, adopt, integrate this human being struggling in the Anthropocene. So I'd like to now talk about how I've molded these ideas, these phytopoietic ideas, into particular practices, often focused on literature and creative writing, in this case exclusively focused. And the first is literary ethnobotany. Now, I define this as works of poetry, prose, scripts, verse, narratives, and other forms of creative writing. But you could also think of this more broadly in terms of creative expressions, multimedia, film, architectural, whatever it may be. But the idea here is that this work engages cultural knowledge of plants as food, materials, totems, teachers, personae. Ethnobotany has its roots in anthropology, and it's often been held as separate, of course, to literary studies. But the idea, as I see it, is that literature and social science come together as a medium for preserving this knowledge. And I'll give you a few examples. The work of Bill Niji, the Aboriginal Australian poet, is both a verse story, it's a poetic story, a poeticized story, but it captures incredibly detailed and intricate knowledge of plants. So it's ethnobotanical in focus. Works such as Stephen Edmund Wendoyo's Rivers of the Forest in Papua New Guinea, and also Pablo Antonio Cuandra's remarkable 7 Trees Against the Dying Light, works of poetry, but also remarkable works of ethnobotanical importance. This is a poem that I recently published in an issue of Plumwood Mountain. It's available online for anyone who's interested. The issue is called Plant Poetics. This for me is an example of literary ethnobotany, a poem by the Chilean poet Jaime Luis Huinun. And I won't read this, but we see elements of literary ethnobotany, the traditional names of plants, also the conception of ecology as relationship, as passion, as the burgeoning of love between organisms. Okay, and the other framework I'd like to mention here, I call entheogenic poetry. These are works written about or after having consumed a plant-based psychoactive substance. And in literary studies, this is considered a kind of marginal area of, you know, the intoxicated poet or the drunken writer. But in fact, if we look more closely at it, entheogenic plants, which are those which have mind altering or consciousness expanding properties, have played a significant role in the history of Western poetry. We see that in Coleridge, in Wilde, and Burroughs and Ginsberg with ayahuasca, McClure with peyote, and more recently poets exploring the world through the influence of cannabis. So this is Michael McClure's, an extract from Michael McClure's work, an American poet associated with the Beat Generation. And we see in this poem traces of the intelligence of the peyote. And we see that in the typography or the physical structure of the poem. Also these kinds of interpolations, I know everything, I pass into the room. And what that signifies is a kind of blending of the subject position of the poet and the plant. So who is this I? Is it the peyote speaking? Is it the poet speaking? Is it a depersonalized I? And so this is a kind of example of what I call entheogenic poetry. And the last example with a phytopoietic basis is human-plant collaborative writing. And I define this in 2 ways. So we can think of this as writing with, so a work, in this case poetry, but any kind of work, architectural or even culinary or whatever it may be, that work composed in dialogue, collaboration, and discourse with living plants. Right? We think of literature as a representation of plants and the natural world, but what if literature were written in collaboration with those plants? Secondly, we can think of this in terms of writing back. So not only are we writing about the plants, or writing with the plants, but we are allowing their own modes of communication, their interpolations to come forth in the work, irrespective of how we choose to mediate that work, whatever it may be, a poem, a building, a dish, even a community. So writing with the plants and also allowing of writing back their own kinds of interpolations to come forth. So we're seeing this, especially in the last decade, in poetry, Gladding's translations from Bark Beetle, Burke's Tree Talks, a poem from the issue Plumwood Mountain that I've published in some of my own work. In Burke's Tree Talks, which is an interesting experiment that crosses between poetry and ethnography, the poet interviewed the plants with questions like, does danger have a meaning for you? She interviewed 7 South Southwest US tree species. And then she fastidiously recorded the response of the plant and attempted to transcribe that. And so what we have is a kind of semiosis or even a glossolalia of plants expressing themselves in response to the questions. And so in some way it's playful, the idea of interviewing the plant, but in another way it's dead serious, right? And that's what I like about this kind of work. It gets us thinking about plant communication and plant intelligence. So just to conclude, I'd like to offer an example from my own work in the New England tablelands of Australia. This is a high plateau region in the northern part of the state on the border of Queensland, and how I've looked at this idea of phytopoiesis. Now, the first example is comes from the Antarctic beech tree habitat of Point Lookout. This is a high elevation area in the middle of the region. It's an enclave of Antarctic beech trees, which once blanketed a lot of Australia, but with the warming climate since the last ice age, these areas have become enclaves. And so in the last bushfire tragedy of 2019 and 2020, up to 50% of these trees were impacted. So they're very, very fragile vestiges of an old flora. And so I've became fascinated with how to poeticize these areas through this idea of phytopoiesis. And this is an example of a poem. It's a large format poem that can be installed in a gallery or other public forum. And I turned the corner and I entered the mind of the forest. You can see there's an attempt to approximate the environment of the tree in the poem through the physical structure of the words. But there's also a kind of rhythm in the poem, the diction and refrains and so forth, that also evoke the sonic environment of the tree and its environment. And the second example I'll conclude on is this series of poems ongoing called Tree, in which I buried a sequence of sonnets in the earth and then attempted to allow the earth to edit the poem with me. So here we see a kind of paper mache effect with the poems palimpsesting and becoming like a mass, and that affects the diction of the poem. Here we see the distortion of a source poem, a famous romantic poem from the 1920s. I'm forgetting the poet's name, a very famous, very romantic evocation of a tree. And so the earth here is excising terms. I think I shall never, a poem lovely as a. So there's this hesitation that's introduced into the poem. And then this process of allowing the earth, the tree and its environment, the insects, the elements and so forth to work over the poem and to introduce their own modes of expression. And this is one poem that served as a source poem, which is still buried somewhere in New South Wales. Okay, thank you very much for that opportunity to speak about phytopoiesis.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We definitely have some time still for questions. So I think we have a lot of great things to discuss and contrast and kind of chew on, so to speak, here. So I saw that there was a question earlier and Lesley was kind enough to type up an answer to it. Lesley, I don't know if you'd like to expound on that one any further or not.
I've actually just lost the question. I think once I answered it, oh no, here it is. Well, the question was about how do we have creative and ethical relationships with invasives, and the answer, it's a really interesting question, and obviously that's the bigger discussion. But I think what I suggested was first we need to break down the that category and think about the specific relations that we have in specific places with specific plants. But I also do think that particularly under the climate change context, many of we need to consider the good qualities that some invasives are going to offer us and reconcile our relationships with the fact that some of them may be important and not yet utilised food sources. Some of them will help in restoration of degraded landscapes and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for your talks. We do have some time for questions, so feel free to put these in the Q&A for either of our panelists or both of them. I was really fascinated with this moment you showed us, John. I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of your work, and we have some shared interests there. And I was really taken with this moment of having the soil edit, you know, this poem with you. So when you know, with what do you do with the results? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an open-ended result, I think. And it's interesting to think of that poem as still in Australia, where I haven't been able to get back to Australia, right? So in some way, the poem lives on and is a work in making, in progress. It's certainly indeterminate and it's open-ended. I guess it's just an experiment in collaboration, and the result is typically for a poet would be to, you know, you write the poem and then you publish it, and the poem is a fairly stable entity. But in this case, it's a highly destabilized entity that has adopted some aspects of plant being in its environment. So yeah, so I haven't thought of that in terms of result, but it's a good question. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
I guess sort of just to jump on that a little bit as well, I was really interested by this notion of heterotemporality that you brought up, John, and thinking about the soil editing the poem. I wonder if there's some form of that going on there as well. You know, with you have this thing that maybe seems static in a way or out of time that you then incorporate into the soil, and then it's sort of maybe losing that quality in some ways. I don't know. Is that something that you think about using that frame or not really?
Yeah, that's interesting. In some ways, the poem is more of a is kind of like a barometer of what's happening in that environment. I remember early on when I would check these poems after burying them, there was a drought at that time a few years ago, and there was very little editing going on, right? So the microorganisms were not active. The processes of decay were not activated by or because of that extended drought in Australia. And the results, of course, of the poem would change with bushfires or with other kind of, with clearance of the forest, right? Where would that poem end up? So yeah, the poem itself maybe adopts that kind of heterotemporality of multiple times at once, right? So part of it is decaying, but then still you have the vestiges of that classical romantic evocation, that poem As Lovely as a Tree just shining forth there, right? So there's this fixity juxtaposed to this radical decomposition. So yeah, I think the plant is a heterotemporal being, and in that case, the idea was to allow the poem to become a heterotemporal entity as well.
Really fascinating. We have a question in the Q&A now. I'm gonna read out that these discussions of plant ethics, which move beyond killing, are often very grounded in local space and intimate personal relations. How might these be scaled up, particularly within the context, for example, of our industrial agricultural relations with plants? I think this might be going in both of your directions, but maybe Lesley, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, really interesting question. I think here we need to examine how we think about scale a bit, because I would argue that even with our industrial agricultural relations, and I've done some work on wheat, you can still get a lot of improved understanding by looking at that very micro scale of how people engage with the plant. And so if we just understand those industrial agriculture as this big monolith that can't be deconstructed at all, we limit ourselves, I think, in terms of physically deconstructing and transforming that kind of relationship. So I would say that there is still a place there for the kind of very grounded research. My book on wheat, it's called Ingrained. You might want to have a look at that. But yeah.
And great, wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a few more questions that have populated the Q&A, and I think we have a few minutes here still. There's a few that are kind of centered on the relationship with invasive, quote unquote, invasive plants, and kind of how that can be negotiated, maybe in urban spaces. What are maybe some guiding principles for navigating these kind of thorny issues?
Yeah, maybe I could take those questions both together. First, we have to acknowledge that it's very contested, and that it is a struggle between different groups of people and different plants. So there's a lot of work in working through the negotiations. But you're right, Janina, that the public perceptions of weediness and tidiness are quite influential as well. So yeah, acknowledge that it's a lot of work. To Helga's question as well, I think, the guiding principles still come back to that contextual analysis, and the same plant can work differently in different contexts, or the same people-plant relationships can work differently in different contexts. So one of the limitations of our management is trying to impose these big categories, I think, that will in practice be negotiated and fought and argued with on the ground.
We have a few more questions for Lesley in the Q&A, but also one for John. And I'm thinking, since we can also do some typed up responses, maybe, and to be mindful of time and maximize this, I'm going to pose the question to John now for a moment so that Lesley has a chance to take a look at these others. So John, Lindsay says, I'm personally interested and invested in this process of writing with plants, and I'm interested in this moment where if the poem is to become written language, there often needs to be a third collaborator, the writer of the text that is distorted. How do you choose this third collaborator? You mentioned romantic poets. Are there other modes for choosing, ways you've navigated this? And then and she says, Wendy's Burk's Tree Talk example maybe avoids this.
Right, so I understand the question as how do we choose collaborators in this kind of activity? I would be guided by the idea of the work as open-ended and the work not entirely of ourselves, right? So typically we sit down, we write a poem, it's our poem, but what if we write the poem into the space of unknowingness and indeterminacy, right? And so we don't actually know who our collaborators will be. It could be that earthworm burrowing through Kilmer's poem, right? I didn't know the earthworm was going to be the collaborator, right? So I think the important part for me is inviting beings to the fold, and maybe putting that poem in the earth is an invitation to beings to join that fold at that particular moment. So, say with the Kilmer poem, it's just, if you write about trees, that poem is always in the background because it's a poem memorized by students, I think even to now, certainly during its time it was. So part of it is satire, like let's just bury that poem. Maybe we can start to see trees in a different way, to embrace their romantic qualities, their beauty of course, and the wonder, but also to be to think of trees differently. So yeah, it's a kind of the experimental art approach of using source material, and I guess that would be considered a collaborator, and then allowing the process to become open to collaborators.
Thank you. I think you've both done an amazing job in answering a lot of very different questions in a very short amount of time. I really I want to thank you for that. We are out of time. I want to make sure that everybody can get to the wrap-up remarks and not miss those. So thank you both again. I think keep connecting on the platform. I think that's a great way to extend the conversation. And Walter, did I miss anything? Any last things to say?
No, that's perfect. Thank you both so much for joining us and sharing your insights and time. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed and had a fruitful discussion here.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for your question.
Thanks everyone, and thanks to you, Ella and Walter, for guiding the session.